Is that meatloaf? Claudia Vexley's voice sliced through the executive cafeteria like a scalpel, polished and precise. Heads turned, forks paused midair. Her heels clicked once, twice, then stopped beside the janitor's table. Marcus didn't look up. He finished wiping the condensation off the outside of his thermos, then clicked it open calmly. "It's for my daughter," he said, "and yours apparently." Single dad janitor got mocked by the CEO for bringing a homemade lunch, until she saw what he was feeding her daughter. That line, unexpected, cold, surgical, cut deeper than any reply she was ready for. Claudia blinked, just once. A murmur rippled through the other tables. Someone choked on their sparkling water. For a moment, it was like the room forgot which one of them was in charge. Drop a like if you've ever wanted to stand up to unreasonable rules like this, and subscribe to see how this strategy plays out. Claudia snapped back quickly, nostrils flaring. "Excuse me?" Marcus finally looked up, calm, unshaken. "I've packed that lunch every day since my wife passed. I don't waste food." He tilted his head slightly. "Would you?" Claudia opened her mouth to retort, but found no words. Marcus had no suit, no title, just a faded blue uniform with his name embroidered on the pocket. He smelled faintly of floor polish and hospital-grade soap, but the way he held her gaze, he wasn't someone scrambling for dignity. He already had it, and somewhere beneath the shallow smirk she wore like armor, something shifted. What they didn't see, what no one in that luxury cafeteria full of glass walls and $25 salads saw, was what the lunch actually meant. Marcus had woken at 4:12 a.m. Quiet not to disturb Lena, he'd rinsed rice, reheated bone broth, and shredded greens with a small paring knife dulled from use. He'd measured everything down to the gram, because Lena's immune system didn't tolerate most preservatives, and because someone else's daughter had started showing up too hungry to say no. He didn't ask questions when the little blonde girl in designer shoes started asking for just a bite. He just packed a little extra each day. This wasn't just about food. It was about promises. Ones he made to his wife when she was dying. Ones he made to Lena every morning before school. It was about doing something that mattered, even if no one noticed. But today, they noticed. Claudia's comment had cut across the room like a whip crack. She hadn't shouted. She didn't need to. The room belonged to her until Marcus answered. He didn't rise. He didn't flinch. He just went back to his food. That quiet defiance stung more than protest. And Claudia, for the first time in a long while, didn't know how to respond to being ignored. "Where are you watching from?" Because this moment right here, is where everything began. The ridicule, the quiet stare, the untouched caviar beside her Evian. This is the moment Claudia Vexley chose the wrong janitor to humiliate. And no one was ready for what he'd already packed inside that lunchbox. Marcus didn't speak for the rest of lunch. He didn't need to. The damage had already been done, and not by him. He slid the thermos lid back into place and tucked the small stainless steel container into a cloth-lined bag. No logos, no plastic. Just functional, clean, and quiet. He left the cafeteria the same way he entered it, without taking up space. In the hallway, he exhaled. Third floor was calling. Bathroom sinks had started to drip again. Someone had cracked a soap dispenser. Routine repairs, predictable problems. Marcus found comfort in the repetition. It gave him distance, gave him a rhythm. But even as he unfastened the janitor's cart and started rolling it down the marble-tiled corridor, his mind stayed behind in that glass-walled room. Not because of the embarrassment. He was used to people like Claudia, but because she didn't even recognize her own daughter's appetite anymore. Sophie Vexley had been slipping into the cafeteria early for nearly a month, always just before the first executive briefings, always alone. It started with one glance, then a question. "Is that real rice?" Then a bite, then two, then three. Marcus never pushed, just offered. It wasn't hard to see the signs. She ate like she was trying to fill something bigger than her stomach, chewed too fast, watched the doors while she swallowed. She was polite, careful. She never took too much, but she came back every time. And so Marcus started making a little more. Carefully balanced portions, high fiber, slow-burning protein, low preservatives, foods that would stabilize blood sugar and reduce her skin rashes. He'd seen it before in his old life, before the mop and the uniform and the no eye contact with upper floors policy. No one had noticed Sophie's need, but Marcus had. He hadn't said a word about it, not when the daycare staff shrugged off her midday fatigue, not when Claudia's assistant mentioned she'd been cranky and tired lately. He didn't say anything because people like Claudia didn't hear people like Marcus. Not until something broke. He paused in front of the service closet and unlocked it. His shoulders ached. He hadn't slept more than 4 hours last night. Lena had been coughing again. He missed his wife most on these kinds of days. Not the anniversaries or the birthdays, but on the quiet, invisible days. The ones where you do something good and no one claps for it. His wife used to say, "We don't do it for applause. We do it because we know better." That phrase had built an entire philosophy for him. He began replacing the broken soap dispenser in silence. His fingers moved automatically. Remove, reseat, screw, test. It reminded him of something else. The way he used to measure child growth charts by hand. The way he adjusted meal plans to the ounce, cross-checking inflammation markers with food logs. It had once felt so important. Now it was a quiet background hum in his life. Until Sophie. He wasn't sure why this bothered him more than usual. Maybe it was how Claudia said it, that clean, casual condescension, that tone that suggested he had no business feeding anyone but his own. But what if feeding both was his business? Because there was no denying it anymore. Sophie was responding to the food. She looked better. She smiled more. She had even stopped scratching her arms so much. That wasn't coincidence. That was clinical. The dispenser clicked into place. He tested the push top. Smooth, clean, precise. Then he stood still for a long moment in the empty bathroom, breathing in the sterile air, eyes fixed on nothing in particular. He had walked away from his old life for good reasons. But maybe, just maybe, it was walking back toward him. He didn't want trouble. He didn't want attention. But he'd watched enough rich parents pretend they were parenting. Watched enough kids fade into corners while their last names held all the power. And today, Claudia Vexley looked right at him and didn't see the man keeping her daughter from falling apart. That wasn't his problem. Claudia Vexley didn't like being ignored, especially not by people whose names she couldn't remember, people who were supposed to disappear into walls, not challenge her in front of a full cafeteria. She spent the next 2 hours storming through meetings, half listening to projections and vendor proposals, while her mind kept circling back to one thing. It's for my daughter. And yours, apparently. The nerve. She tapped her stylus harder than necessary on the edge of her tablet. The assistant beside her flinched. Claudia barely noticed. The irony wasn't lost on her, being rattled by a janitor. She had been through corporate takeovers, lawsuits, boardroom coups, yet somehow, a man with a mop and a thermos had left her speechless. She blamed the delivery, too calm, too calculated. Like he knew something she didn't. That was the part she couldn't shake. After her last meeting, Claudia headed toward the executive suite to retrieve her daughter. It was later than usual. Sophie didn't like staying past 5, but Claudia had gotten tied up. She opened the daycare door and found Sophie curled in a chair by the window, coloring quietly, her hair pulled into a slightly crooked braid. Someone else's handiwork. "Sweetheart," Claudia said, voice clipped but softening. "You ready?" Sophie nodded and slid the coloring sheet into her backpack. Claudia noticed crumbs on her blouse and paused. "What did you eat today?" Sophie shrugged. "Lunch." "Yes, but what kind?" "You didn't have your usual from home." "Mr. Marcus gave me rice and soup. It was good." Claudia straightened. "Marcus?" "The janitor." Sophie said it like she was telling her mother the sky was blue. Claudia's expression didn't change, but something settled behind her eyes. "And how many times has he done that?" "I don't know," Sophie said. "A lot. He always gives me the soft eggs, the kind that don't make my tummy hurt." Claudia blinked. That old issue, bloating, light rashes, crankiness, had been coming and going for weeks. She'd been meaning to book another specialist appointment. "You didn't tell me you were still having stomach pain?" Sophie shrugged again, pulling her sleeves down. It's not bad when I eat his food. There it was. Matter of fact. Like Marcus had solved what Claudia's team of nannies, pediatricians, and allergists hadn't. Claudia felt a chill, not of fear, but of insulted pride. She walked her daughter out of the daycare and into the gold-accented elevator without a word. Her grip on Sophie's hand was gentle, but her thoughts were steel-hard. She didn't like being indebted, and she definitely didn't like surprises, especially ones that made her look incompetent. Back in her apartment that night, Claudia poured a glass of wine and sat on her balcony, city lights stretching into the dark. She kept replaying the day in her mind, the remark, the stare, the cafeteria full of watching eyes, the quiet confidence in Marcus's voice. She was supposed to be the one with the upper hand, the title, the power. So why did it feel like he had seen her and decided she wasn't worth more than a glance? She tapped her phone, opening the corporate staff directory, typed, Marcus. There were 3 entries. She clicked the one marked Facilities Maintenance, Night Shift. No last name listed. She frowned. No photo, no background. Just a badge number and schedule. Who are you, really? Meanwhile, in the small second-floor apartment across town, Marcus tucked Lena into bed. She was thinner than she should have been, growing too fast, too lean. But her cheeks looked better this week, less pale. That gave him enough hope to keep moving. Tomorrow's test day, Lena murmured. I know, Marcus said, brushing her hair behind her ear. Everything's ready. You packed it? I packed it, he confirmed. Extra lemon water and your lucky pencil. She smiled and closed her eyes. When he left her room, he paused at the doorway, looking back at the framed photo on her nightstand. His wife, holding a nutrition textbook in one hand, Lena's newborn foot in the other. He nodded to her, quietly, then turned off the light. Claudia and Marcus, 2 parents on opposite sides of the city, sat in their silence, each haunted by the same question for the first time. What else don't I know about him? The next morning, Claudia arrived early. Not because of a meeting, not because of Sophie. She just needed to see it. The executive cafeteria opened promptly at 7:30 a.m., but Claudia was already seated by the window when the first tray of croissants hit the marble counter. Her coffee sat untouched, cooling beside her tablet. She wore a dove-gray blazer, no jewelry except the platinum band watch circling her wrist. Power and restraint. And then, there he was. Marcus entered quietly through the rear service corridor, just as he always did. No fanfare, no chatter, just motion. One step at a time, a soft cloth bag tucked under his arm. He moved to the far corner table, not near the buffet, not under the spotlight. Claudia watched as he carefully unzipped the bag and removed 2 identical stainless steel lunch tins. One he set aside. The other he opened. Inside, brown rice, soft vegetables, turmeric broth poured from a thermos. A small side of sliced pears. Claudia blinked. It wasn't just food. It was intentional food. Caloric ratios, anti-inflammatory pairings, low glycemic index. It was a diet designed for regulation and recovery. It wasn't a meal. It was protocol. Before she could move, Sophie ran in. Claudia's eyebrows lifted. She hadn't even realized her daughter had come upstairs. Sophie moved with purpose, her backpack thudding onto the bench before she slid next to Marcus like she did it every day. Claudia's heart tightened. Marcus gave her a nod and handed her a small spoon. Slow today, he said. Sophie nodded obediently and stirred the broth before sipping. There was no performance, no fuss, just care. Claudia stood slowly. She didn't make a scene. She approached their table like a guest arriving late to a private ritual. Sophie noticed her first. Mom, she said brightly, you're early. Claudia's eyes flicked to the spoon. Sophie was eating without flinching. No grimace, no wincing. Her cheeks had color. She was settled. I see you two have a routine, Claudia said, voice carefully neutral. Marcus didn't rise. He nodded once. She comes hungry. I feed her. Claudia's jaw tightened. You work in facilities. Who gave you permission to feed my child? No one, he said simply. She needed food. I had extra. She looked at him for a long moment. And what gives you the confidence to assume your food is safer than what I provide? Marcus tapped the side of the lunchbox. Because it's tailored for someone with histamine intolerance, blood sugar fluctuations, and mild oral allergy syndrome, which is what your daughter has, or hasn't been told she has. Claudia's spine stiffened, her gaze narrowed. You're guessing? I'm not? How would you know? Marcus finally looked her dead in the eyes. Because before I took this job, I was a pediatric nutritionist, licensed, board certified, specializing in metabolic disorders. Your daughter's symptoms are classic. Sophie had gone quiet, sensing the shift. Claudia stared, lips parted. Marcus stood slowly, lunchbox in hand. He didn't loom, he didn't threaten. He simply let the truth land between them like a weight. You can call HR, you can file a complaint, you can even accuse me of crossing a line, but you won't change what your daughter's body already knows, that someone's been listening to it, carefully. He slid the second lunchbox back into his bag. That's all I've got to say. Then he walked out, same as always. Sophie turned to her mother, confusion flickering in her eyes. Was that bad? Claudia didn't answer right away, because for the first time in years, she'd realized she was behind. Not in business, not in negotiations, but in knowing her own child. And the man she mocked in public had known more about her daughter's body than she had. Not because he was lucky, but because he saw her. And Claudia hated that she hadn't. Marcus didn't return to the cafeteria the next morning. Not because of fear, not because of shame, because it was test day. Lena's results were due by noon. The blood work, the panels, the scans, they'd all been building to this. Marcus had promised her they'd go through it together, just like they had with her mother. So he cleaned early, clocked out late, and tucked a sealed folder into the inside pocket of his jacket. But still, Claudia noticed his absence. She entered the cafeteria with calculated calm, scanning the tables. No thermos, no metal tins, no quiet corner occupied by someone who had no business being seen. And strangely, she felt untethered. Sophie sat across from her with a pre-packed breakfast from the company lounge, whole-grain muffin, low-fat milk, sliced apples, and plastic, but she only picked at it. No Mr. Marcus food today? Claudia asked, trying to make it sound casual. Sophie shook her head. He said he had somewhere important to be. Claudia nodded, but inside something prickled. She'd dismissed the man so quickly, too quickly, and now she wasn't sure who he was anymore. Back at her office, she summoned her assistant. Pull Marcus's employment file, she said. Minutes later, a thin report landed on her desk. No college listed, no certifications, just 5 years of spotless maintenance records, 2 glowing internal reviews, and a disciplinary note for using company kitchen equipment off hours. Claudia frowned. That wasn't the profile of a pediatric specialist. But something didn't add up. She dialed the building's head of HR. Can you confirm whether Marcus Bell has a background in healthcare? Officially, the HR manager said. Number. But off the record, I've heard rumors. Before he applied here, he dropped off a resume with degrees, licenses, the works. Then he came back the next day and handed in a different one, said he just needed the job, no explanation. Claudia went still. That wasn't just strange, that was intentional. She ended the call and stared at the file again. Her reflection blinked back at her from the polished desktop. Perfect makeup, perfect title, perfect ignorance. Across town, Marcus sat beside Lena in the pediatric clinic's waiting room. Fluorescent lights flickered above them. She clutched his hand, not out of fear, but out of habit. You okay? He asked. I'm fine, she said. But you're squeezing my fingers. He smiled faintly and let go. The folder in his pocket felt heavier with each passing minute. The nurse finally called them in. Behind the closed door, the doctor spoke gently, pointed to charts, used phrases like manageable if caught early, diet compliance, and possible autoimmune flags. Marcus nodded through all of it, took notes, asked questions only a professional would know to ask. And when it was over, he thanked the doctor, helped Lena put her backpack on, and let her out. Another battle won, but another war brewing. They stopped at a bench outside the clinic. Marcus pulled out the second lunchbox and handed it to her. Same contents, same care. Thanks, Dad, she said, opening it eagerly. As she ate, he stared out across the street, lost in thought. He had built a quiet life out of necessity. Left behind a name, a reputation, a field where he had once lectured and published and taught residents. But in that silence, he'd watched another child, someone else's, start to slip through cracks no one else saw. And he couldn't unsee that now. Back at the office, Claudia stared out her own window, watching clouds over the skyline. Her daughter had stopped complaining about stomach aches, stopped itching her arms. Her moods had stabilized, and the only variable that had changed was a janitor's lunch. She tapped her stylus against the desk again. What kind of man walks away from credentials? From a career? What kind of man feeds a stranger's child with surgical precision and doesn't say a word about it? One who doesn't need recognition. One who's already lost too much. One who does the right thing because someone has to. She closed the file. She didn't need to dig any deeper, but she couldn't ignore him anymore, either. Friday morning began with chaos. Marcus had barely slipped into the building when the intercom crackled overhead. Medical emergency reported. Executive level 3. Medical team en route. He froze mid-step, eyes narrowing. Level 3. That was the executive wing, the daycare suite, Sophie. The cart he was pushing slammed into the wall as he pivoted, bolting for the elevator without hesitation. He jabbed the button and bounced on the balls of his feet as the numbers crawled down. Come on. Come on. When the doors finally opened, he didn't wait for anyone to step out. He slipped in and pressed the button so hard the panel beeped twice. The ride up felt like a lifetime. When he burst into the hallway, he didn't need to ask what was happening. He saw it instantly. A cluster of staff crowded outside the daycare suite. One assistant was crying, another was on her phone, voice trembling. And on the floor, slumped in a corner with her knees drawn up and arms trembling, was Sophie. Claudia knelt beside her, panic carved into her otherwise impenetrable face. She was saying something, too fast, too loud. But Sophie wasn't responding. Her lips were pale. She was sweating through her shirt. Marcus moved before anyone registered him. He dropped to his knees beside them and gently touched Sophie's wrist. "Don't touch her," Claudia started, voice sharp with fear. "She's crashing," Marcus cut in. "Do you know what she ate?" Claudia blinked. She had a muffin. From the breakfast bar. Ingredients? I don't know. It had blueberries. Maybe walnuts. Marcus's jaw locked. She has birch pollen allergy. If that muffin had raw apple or certain tree nuts, it would trigger an oral syndrome cascade. The crowd around them fell completely silent. "How do you know that?" Claudia asked, breathless. "Because I've been feeding her the last 4 weeks," he said, reaching into his bag. He pulled out a narrow blue pouch, small, worn, clearly pre-packed. Inside were 2 electrolyte packets, a child-safe antihistamine chew, and a foil-wrapped meal bar with ingredient notations in sharp black pen. "Help me sit her up," he said. Claudia obeyed. Marcus worked fast, not frantic, trained. He dissolved the chew in her mouth, gently coaxed her to swallow, then opened the bar, broke off a piece, and held it against her lips. "Small bites. This is histamine safe. Watch her color." Sophie's eyes fluttered. Her breathing hitched, then steadied. Claudia stared in disbelief. The EMTs arrived seconds later, red bags swinging, but Marcus already had her propped, stabilized, monitored. "She's conscious," he said. "Vitals still shaky. Keep her upright and monitor blood pressure. No epinephrine unless her throat closes. This is an OAS reaction, not full anaphylaxis. You'll want to check for mild swelling behind the lower jaw." One of the medics blinked. "You a nurse?" "Nutritionist," Marcus said, still focused. "Pediatrics, retired." Claudia felt her legs go numb. Not because Sophie was safe, but because she had no idea the man she had mocked was the only one in that hallway who hadn't panicked. The medics took over and wheeled Sophie out. Claudia followed, still stunned. Later that afternoon, after the adrenaline wore off and her daughter was stable in the hospital observation room, Claudia sat beside her sleeping form and whispered, "He saved you. Again." And then the guilt hit like a wave. She'd called him out in front of her staff, questioned his character, treated his kindness as a violation. And yet, When her child was in danger, he moved with certainty, not hesitation. He had planned for this. He had seen it coming, and he had been ready when she wasn't. Meanwhile, Marcus sat on the edge of the company's rooftop, breathing in the crisp air as the sun began to dip behind glass towers. He didn't need thanks. He didn't expect it. He just hoped Sophie would be okay. He thought of Lena eating the rest of her lunch in the break room down below. He thought of his wife, who had trusted him with every recipe, every data sheet, every ounce of their daughter's care. That little pouch he carried, his wife's design. She'd called it their silent medicine cabinet, because sometimes care didn't need to shout. Sometimes it just needed to show up, prepared. Marcus didn't expect a thank you. He didn't expect anything, really. So when Claudia showed up on the maintenance floor the next morning, heels clicking too sharply against industrial tile, it caught him off guard. He was crouched beside a broken water fountain, wrench in hand, sleeves rolled to the elbow. The scent of copper and disinfectant filled the air. She hesitated a few steps away, unsure how to begin. Marcus glanced up. "You lost again?" Claudia let out a short breath. "No." Silence filled the narrow corridor. The clink of his wrench against the pipe echoed, measured and steady. She took a step closer. "I spoke to the paramedics." He kept working. "They said what you did saved her from a full shutdown. That if you hadn't known what to give her..." He stood, wiped his hands on a cloth, and looked at her. "She okay?" Claudia nodded. "Resting, still tired, but okay." "Good." Another pause. "I misjudged you." He didn't smile, didn't gloat. Just folded the cloth and slipped it into his back pocket. "I know." The acknowledgement hit harder than anger ever could. She took it without flinching. "I pulled your old HR record," she admitted. "The first one, before you withdrew it." Marcus didn't respond. "You left a field of pediatric nutrition, top tier. You were published in medical journals, lectured in Toronto, spoke at international conferences." She searched his face. "Why did you walk away?" He met her eyes. "Because none of it saved my wife." That answer stripped the air between them bare. Claudia's voice softened. "I didn't know." "You weren't supposed to," he said. He turned back to the fountain and adjusted the valve. She stepped beside him now, closer than before. "I'm not here to fix things with a promotion or write you into a press release." "I wouldn't accept either," she nodded. "But I need to understand," she said. "Why her?" Marcus paused. "You mean, why did I feed your daughter?" "Yes." He turned the wrench slowly. "Because she came in hungry, and no one noticed." She flinched, not visibly, but something in her breath betrayed her. "And because I've seen what happens when you ignore signs early. A scratch becomes a rash. A mood swing becomes a meltdown. A tired kid becomes a sick one." He turned the valve again, tested the water. Clean, cold, flowing. "You don't need to be a doctor to know when a child isn't being listened to," he said. Claudia looked down at the floor. The scuffed tiles, the faint smell of bleach. Nothing about this space spoke of brilliance or expertise. And yet, standing there, she felt like she was the one who'd fallen behind. "Why didn't you say anything?" she asked quietly. "Would you have listened?" She didn't answer. Behind them, the elevator dinged. The hallway was still empty. "Your daughter is sharp," Marcus said. "She watches everything, and she's careful about how she speaks. That tells me she's learned silence is safer." Claudia's throat tightened. He didn't press it, just handed her a folded paper towel. On it, neatly written in black ink, was a food plan. "Low histamine intake," he said. "Avoid apples, stone fruits, raw nuts. Rotate meals every 3 days to reduce immune buildup. There's a probiotic strain listed. Get it compounded, not over the counter. And make sure whoever cooks for her isn't using seed oils." She stared at the list like it was a map. "She'll be fine if you're consistent," Marcus added. "She just needs someone who sees the pattern." Claudia took the paper without a word. He picked up his wrench again. She looked at him, this time with something far from disdain. Almost reverence or regret. "Thank you," she said finally. He didn't nod, didn't reply, just went back to work. but she stood there a moment longer before turning and walking away. Not because she didn't know what to say, but because for once saying less seemed like the right thing to do. Marcus arrived at work the next morning to find his janitor's cart missing. For a moment, he stood still, staring at the empty space where it always waited, beside the boiler room door, tucked neatly between two rusted lockers. It wasn't just a cart. It was part of his rhythm, his shield. Without it, he felt strangely exposed. Then he noticed something else. A company envelope, white and crisp, taped to the locker. He pulled it down and opened it slowly, expecting a reprimand, maybe even a quiet termination. What he read instead made his brow furrow. Please report to conference room C at 9 a.m. No signature, just a time, just a place. Marcus checked his watch. He had 15 minutes. He walked the long hallway to the executive floor with deliberate steps, passing polished marble walls and gold-trimmed elevator panels that looked like they belonged to a world he'd once left behind. By the time he reached the glass-walled conference room, two executives were already inside, murmuring behind sleek laptops. Claudia was there too, standing, arms crossed, facing the window. He paused at the threshold. Claudia turned first. "Come in." He stepped inside. The door whispered shut behind him. "I assume you're wondering why you're here," one of the executives began, an older man in a tailored navy suit. Marcus didn't answer. He just stood, hands folded. Claudia glanced at her colleagues, then spoke. "We had an incident this week," she said, "and it exposed a glaring liability in our child care protocols." Marcus said nothing. Claudia continued. "What you did for my daughter was above and beyond, but it also raised a question among our leadership. Why do we have people with critical expertise working invisible jobs?" The room went quiet. Marcus raised an eyebrow. "You want to talk about talent placement now?" "Not just placement," Claudia said, stepping forward. "About purpose, alignment, skills wasted." She slid a thin folder across the table. He didn't reach for it. "It's a proposal," she said, "a transition. We've created a position, Wellness Integration Officer, overseeing nutritional planning for our daycare and family support programs. It's not flashy, but it's real." He looked at her. "Why?" Claudia met his gaze. "Because I finally realized what it costs to ignore the people who actually understand care. You fixed a problem money couldn't touch, and you did it without fanfare, without asking for anything in return." Marcus glanced at the folder, then back at her. "What makes you think I want to step back into that world?" She hesitated. "I don't. But I think someone like you should be the one to decide." He reached for the folder, opened it. The role was clearly defined. Modest salary bump, flexible hours, full health care. It wasn't a corporate showpiece. It was functional, purposeful, designed with real use in mind. And in the bottom corner of the document, a line of credit had been quietly added. Position recommended by Claudia Vexley. Marcus closed the folder. "I'll think about it," he said. Claudia nodded once. "That's all I ask." The other executives looked mildly confused. Clearly they'd expected this to be more celebratory. But Marcus didn't play to an audience. He exited the room the same way he came in, steady, quiet, in control. Later that afternoon, back in the boiler room, he found his janitor cart returned, but someone had cleaned it. The wheels had been oiled, the cloths folded, the tools placed with surgical precision. No note, no message, just order, restored. He set the cart aside and opened his notebook. At the top of a fresh page he wrote, "Prep materials for family nutrition class, pilot module draft." It was a plan he'd shelved years ago. A community-based course for single parents dealing with child-specific food sensitivities. Simple curriculum. High impact. He stared at the page for a long moment, then began writing again, steady lines forming like bricks being laid for something bigger. Not a return to his past, but a repurposing of it. Saturday arrived with a quiet sort of anticipation. Marcus stood outside the community center just before noon, a tote bag slung over one shoulder. Inside were laminated charts, allergy-safe recipe cards, and a set of wooden food models he'd carved himself. Peas, eggs, tiny fruit slices. Tools for teaching, tools for showing, not just telling. He hadn't run a class in 5 years, but Lena was the one who pushed him. "You've already taught me everything," she'd said. "Maybe it's time to teach other people's kids too." So, he drafted a curriculum, reached out to a contact at the center, pitched a weekend trial class. To his surprise, they agreed. Now, standing at the edge of the polished floor, folding chairs in neat rows, he waited. By 12:15, 3 parents had shown up. One father with twins, a mother juggling a fussy toddler, and, unexpectedly, Claudia. Not in heels, not in a suit. Just jeans, flats, and a slightly uncertain expression. She entered holding Sophie's hand, their lunch packed in matching stainless steel tins. Marcus didn't comment, but his chest tightened. Not because she was there, because she had clearly come to listen. He opened the class the way he always used to. "Every child has a voice," he said. "Sometimes it's not words, it's symptoms, behavior, mood, reactions. What they can't say, their bodies will." The parents leaned forward. Claudia took notes. Sophie sat in the front row, watching with wide eyes. He moved through the material with ease, explaining histamine response patterns, how to build rotation diets, and the quiet signs of nutrient sensitivity often mistaken for tantrums. He used no big words, no medical jargon, just stories, and data, and patient practiced insight. Halfway through, he passed out color-coded meal maps. Claudia stared at hers, realization dawning with each box. These weren't general guides, they were diagnostics in disguise. By the end of the class, even the toddlers were calmer, sitting on mats with toy carrots and plastic spoons. After the last parent left, Claudia stayed behind. She approached Marcus while Sophie played with Lena in the corner, the 2 girls now fast friends. "You should be doing this full time," Claudia said. "I used to," Marcus replied, packing away the cards. "Why did you stop?" He hesitated. Then, "Because I needed to focus on one child." She nodded, quietly absorbing the weight of that. "Lena's lucky." Marcus looked over at the girls. "They all are, if we just pay attention." Claudia studied him, then glanced at the tote bag by his feet. "You made those food models yourself?" He nodded. "Most kids learn by touching, seeing. Abstracts don't help them." She crouched down and picked up a carved egg, smoothed her thumb over the sanded surface. "You're not just teaching nutrition," she said. "You're teaching presence." That caught him off guard. He didn't reply, but her words stuck. That night, back at home, Marcus sat beside Lena as she worked through a workbook. The table was cluttered with drafts, meal plans, sticky notes. She looked up. "How'd it go?" "Better than expected," she grinned. "Told you." He tapped her pencil playfully, then turned serious. "They asked me to take the wellness officer role." At the company, Lena's eyes widened. "Are you going to?" "I'm thinking about it." "Would it mean more classes?" "Eventually, if I build it right." She nodded, then looked down at her page. "I think you should." "Why?" "Because it's not just about me anymore." That landed like a bell in his chest. He sat back, folded his arms. Maybe it really wasn't about staying small anymore. Maybe it was time to start building again. Not the title, not the prestige, but something practical, lasting, with reach. And maybe, just maybe, Claudia Vexley wasn't the enemy he once thought she was. Not anymore. The email came Monday morning. Subject line: Immediate request. Executive board presentation. Wednesday. Marcus almost didn't open it. He'd just clocked in, keys clipped to his belt, uniform still creased from the dryer. But the sender caught his eye. Claudia Vexley. He clicked. Inside was a single sentence. "We're preparing to launch the Family Wellness Division. Your insight needs to lead the conversation." Attached was a boardroom schedule. 30 minutes, prime slot. Right after quarterly numbers, right before external partners. It wasn't a suggestion. Marcus sat back in the break room chair, heart steady but aware. This wasn't just a meeting, it was a spotlight, and he hadn't stood under one of those in years. At lunchtime, he found Claudia in her glass-walled office, which now had a subtle addition. A small lunch tin on her desk, clean, stainless steel, a sign. "You want me to speak to the board?" he asked. Claudia nodded. Not as a formality, as proof. They won't believe in this program unless they see the face behind it. Marcus crossed his arms. You're sure they want a janitor standing at that table? She didn't blink. They're not getting a janitor. They're getting the man who saved my daughter and taught me how to listen again. He said nothing. She added, tell them about the lunch boxes, the patterns. Tell them what no spreadsheet ever could. That night, he sat at his kitchen table, papers spread out in neat grids. Lena sat across from him, chewing her pencil, helping where she could. I don't know if I want to go back to all that, he murmured. Lena glanced up. Why? He exhaled slowly. Because the last time I wore a title, I lost focus. I started building programs instead of paying attention to people. She tilted her head. But now, you're doing both. That gave him pause. And maybe she was right. Maybe this wasn't about climbing back into old shoes. Maybe it was about walking in new ones, worn from use but still strong. By Tuesday, he had a presentation outline, handwritten, no slides, no flashy stats, just examples, food logs, real kids, simple truths. Claudia reviewed it once, gave a single nod, and said, don't change a word. Wednesday morning arrived with the weight of something turning. Marcus didn't wear a suit. He didn't need to. Just a clean shirt, pressed slacks, and the quiet authority of someone who knew what mattered. He walked into the boardroom 10 minutes early. The room was cold, all glass and steel. Executives chatted over lattes, laptops glowed, a screen flickered to life. Claudia stood at the end of the table. When she saw him, she nodded, not formally, not with obligation, with respect. As the quarterly reports wrapped up, Claudia stepped forward. We're proposing a new investment, she said, in family health, childcare nutrition, and internal wellness education. But numbers won't explain the heart of it. Then she turned. Marcus? He stepped forward, eyes scanning the room, no tremble in his hands, no rush in his voice. I don't have a pitch, he began. I have a lunchbox. He placed it gently on the table, opened it. Inside, steamed rice, poached chicken, a handful of blueberries, and a hard-boiled egg, sliced. This was the first meal I gave your VP's daughter, he said. Not because I was told to, but because she was hungry and no one else noticed. Silence blanketed the room. I used to design hospital programs for immunosensitive kids. I left after my wife passed, took a quieter job to raise our daughter, thought I was done teaching. He let that sit. But then I saw the same patterns in another child, and I realized I still had something to give. He passed out the meal maps, the logs, the simplified guides. One exec leaned in, eyebrows raised. This isn't just wellness, Marcus continued. It's retention, it's focus, it's care in the places no one tracks. He looked directly at the CEO. If your employees' kids are thriving, your employees show up better. You want loyalty? Start by feeding the future. The room stayed quiet a beat longer. Then came the nods, slow, genuine. Marcus stepped back. He didn't need applause, but for the first time in a long time, he felt seen and heard for exactly who he was. The emails started that afternoon. Subject lines like, nutrition support for my son? Can we pilot in regional offices? Your lunchbox system. More info, please. They weren't just from board members or department heads. They came from receptionists, security guards, overworked project leads. People Marcus had passed in hallways for years who had never once looked up. Now they were looking, and not at his uniform, at his work, at his care. He sat at a quiet corner table near the loading dock, going through them one by one. He wasn't overwhelmed, not yet, but he was aware this was a pivot point. The board had given formal approval for the pilot, a 6-month test, limited to one floor of the company, a modest start. But the ripple had already begun. Claudia stopped by around 4 p.m., unannounced. Your inbox probably hates you, she said. Marcus didn't look up. It's not the inbox I'm worried about. It's how many of them are asking questions they should have been asking years ago. She nodded. That's the point, isn't it? Sure, but systems don't change just because someone gave a good speech. They change when people stop pretending the small things don't matter. She pulled out a chair and sat down. Then we'll build it that way, from the bottom up. He watched her for a moment. You really mean that? She hesitated, but only for a second. I've been watching you feed the truth to people, one spoonful at a time. You didn't shove it down their throats. You invited them to taste. That surprised a laugh out of him, not loud, but real. He set the laptop aside. You're starting to talk like someone who listens. Maybe I am. Outside, the light was starting to fade, soft orange streaking across the concrete courtyard. Marcus leaned back in his chair. You know, there's a part of me that still doesn't trust this place to hold something delicate. You don't have to, Claudia said. Just trust your part in it. He looked down at his hands, calloused, steady. Still, after everything, the hands of a teacher. You think the board really understood what I said? No, she admitted, but they felt it, and that's how it begins. Later that evening, Marcus picked Lena up from her after-school program. She ran to him, backpack bouncing. Guess what? She beamed. My teacher asked where I learned how to make my lunch plan. I told her it was from my dad. Yeah? What did she say? She wants you to come talk to our class next week. She said most parents don't know how to pack for allergies without just avoiding everything. He opened the car door for her, heart suddenly heavy, but in the good way. They're paying attention, he said, almost to himself. Lena slid in and buckled her seatbelt. They should have been all along. He shut the door and walked around the car slowly. Clouds were shifting overhead. Back home, he heated up dinner while Lena did homework. She had questions about proteins and enzymes, and he answered without thinking. It felt normal, but different too, because now what he gave her at their kitchen table was being passed on to strangers, co-workers, executives, kids he'd never meet. And that meant something? He opened his drawer and pulled out the old index card, the one his wife had written their first family rule on after Lena's diagnosis. Start with what you know. Build with what you care about. He slid it into his shirt pocket, not for display, just for reminder. Wednesday would bring more meetings, more logistics, more charts and approvals and fine print. But tonight, he was just a father feeding his daughter with the same quiet purpose that had started it all. And in the silence of that small kitchen, one thing became absolutely clear. His life hadn't gone off course. It had finally found its path. 3 months later, the family wellness pilot was no longer a pilot. It was a full-fledged department, now referred to as core care, and it was reshaping the way the company thought about employee support. Quietly, efficiently, without corporate flash, but with impact. Marcus sat in what used to be the underutilized west wing of the daycare floor. It had been converted into a warm, practical space. Low tables, open shelves filled with food models, hands-on visuals, and a little chalkboard where Sophie had written in uneven letters, "Food is feelings too." There were new faces every week, parents looking for help, employees stopping in with questions. Some just came to sit for a moment, eat in silence, and remember they were human. Marcus made no announcements. He didn't care for office gossip or internal newsletters. He let the work speak. But today was different. Today was the company's quarterly town hall, and Claudia had insisted he speak again, this time to the entire staff. He stood at the front of the auditorium, lights dimmed just enough to focus the room. Lena was seated in the front row, swinging her feet and beaming. Claudia introduced him simply. The reason our company understands families better today than it did 6 months ago. Marcus approached the podium with his usual calm. No suit, just a clean shirt and the confidence of someone whose truth no longer needed defense. I'm not here to pitch a product, he began, or to tell you how great a program is. He paused, looking around the packed room. I'm here because one day someone mocked me for the lunch I packed. Because I was a janitor feeding a CEO's daughter, several people shifted in their seats. She didn't know that lunch wasn't just food. It was protection. It was insight. It was years of tracking symptoms, trial and error, studying patterns no doctor had time to notice. He stepped away from the podium now, holding up a card. This is a food log, the kind I've kept for every kid I've ever worked with, including my own daughter. You don't need a PhD to keep one. You need to care. You need to look and listen. He let the silence breathe. I left my old profession because I thought I had failed. But I've come to understand that caring doesn't stop just because your title changes. Sometimes stepping down is how you show up. In the front row, Claudia gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. Core Care isn't here to revolutionize anything. It's here to remember what matters, that if we want focused, loyal, thriving employees, we have to protect what keeps them grounded, and for most people, that's their kids. A murmur of agreement moved through the room. Marcus closed with a quiet smile. We didn't invent something new, we just finally saw what was already working in the shadows. When he stepped down, there was no standing ovation, but there were tears. A line of employees formed after. Some shook his hand, others hugged him. One quietly slipped him a note that simply read, "Thank you." My son sleeps through the night now. Back in his office, Lena spun slowly in the guest chair, watching him with pride. "You're kind of famous now," she teased. "Not interested," Marcus replied, placing the food log card back in his drawer. "Then why are you still doing it?" He looked at her. "Because it's not just about us anymore." That night, Claudia sent him a text. "Your story reached people I never could. Thank you for holding the line." He stared at the message a long time before replying. We all hold something. Some of us just do it quieter. Marcus never returned to his former title. He didn't need to. He had something more powerful now, a legacy built not on status, but on substance. And in the hearts of every child his work had touched, he was already more than a title. He was the reason they could eat, sleep, learn, grow. He was the reason a CEO had learned how to listen. And he was proof that sometimes the people we overlook are the ones who carry the answers we've been too proud to hear. Subscribe and don't miss our next story. Single dad, janitor got called too poor to raise a girl, then bought his daughter a $120,000 violin in front of everyone. Trust me, you'll feel it. And tell me in the comments, what injustice should we tackle next?